What's going on, everyone? So I was sitting down and I was thinking about all the cards that have really messed up either people that I've watched in tournaments or myself during my play, or cards that when I did play just had some amazing effects that I really don't see all that often. These are some of the best cards. I believe we're talking about 8 of them today that people just aren't playing enough, mainly because either something from set 2 came out and they kind of phased out some of the previous cards thinking that these set 2 cards were better, but well, turns out they're not, or they're just kind of forgotten about from set 2 because the initial rating on them was poor and they just never got off to a good start. Before we dive into it, big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon, guys. Thank you for supporting anything that I do here, as well as I have a TCG player link in the description down below. Be sure to use it for any of the cards you might want to pick up, especially the ones for this video. And to start off this list, we got to talk about a card that is an extremely unassuming, almost sideboard card, but it has been so impressive to run in the main deck, especially now in the meta, that I have to put it on the list. Heck, I don't even see Confiscate enough in the sideboard of some decks. I see Disabling Fangfighter a decent chunk playing main deck and sideboard, which makes a good amount of sense because, you know, it's just a standard unit that is a little bit subpar unless you get the defeat of an upgrade part of it. But this is a 1 resource universal card that I've been putting in the main decks, either 1 to 2 copies of. And because of the way Star Wars Unlimited kind of pans out, the ability to draw 2 cards a turn and resource anything that doesn't really look all that great, this is a very minimal downside because there's a lot of cards in a lot of decks where you'll put them in to kind of smooth out the curve or to kind of just have extra options when you're playing in certain decks. And because of control decks coming a little bit more into the meta and you're seeing entrenched more frequently, you already saw Traitorous or heck Dark Sabers even, Confiscate ends up becoming more and more valuable as more upgrades are being played. And yes, Disabling Fangfighter is a nice universal way if you are playing aggression to go ahead and drop in your deck for like Han Blue, for example, or maybe even Sabine Green. But this is a 1 resource way, and that cannot be understated because 3 resources to deal with an upgrade is still a lot, and it can kind of prevent you from making other plays that you actually do want to be making. So Confiscate, absolutely amazing. I know I did my video the other day on like anti-control, and I was playing Tarkin Yellow with 3 of Confiscate main deck, and I was actually just impressed. I never played 3 of Confiscate main deck, but it impressed me basically in like every other matchup, which is really crazy for a potentially sideboard card, but you should definitely consider dropping 1 to 2 of these in the main deck if you're playing any sort of mid-range or deck that's focusing on units in general. Next card we got to talk about is Choose Sides. Now, I'm not going to lie, guys. This is a card that I had 0 faith in. I put very far down on kind of my ratings of some of the legendaries and rares. And of course, as I've said in many videos, I am bound to be wrong about some cards, and I only really was convinced when I got demolished by Choose Sides. Now, this is not a card similar to Confiscate that you're going to be running the full 3 of in your main deck, and in fact, most of the cards that we're going to talk about today usually fit well as a 1 to 2 of, where there are niche situations or as sideboard options. This is a card where I have been playing 1 to 2 of main deck, especially in these more value-oriented decks, because this is a card where initially I was thinking, okay, what are the chances that you're going to have this weaker unit that you're going to want to exchange with some other unit on the battlefield? It's too situational, but really this comes into play when you're playing some of these more soft control style of decks and your opponent is also playing a soft control or maybe a more high value deck, maybe like a double green Palpatine. And randomly you are playing like a Darth Vader and you get a 3 resource play, or maybe a 2 resource play and a 1 resource play, or maybe just a 2 resource play. This is where Choose Sides becomes really good. And this is something that's not uncommon. You play your Darth Vader, or maybe you just play a couple of lower resource plays, and you just choose sides, and exchanging a 2 resource play for one of their 7 resource plays is massive, okay? It's not just like, oh, you are getting a small bump and you kind of remove their unit. It is completely game swinging, especially if you're relying as the person who's just playing that whatever play. Maybe it's a reinforcement walker, maybe it's a maul, maybe it's, I don't know, like a Jabba's ranker, whatever it is. You were relying on that big unit to kind of stabilize the board or kind of give you that advantage. And getting like a Yularen in place of whatever big unit is immensely powerful. Now, again, this is a card that I would probably put like one of main deck in, like, well, something like Kira Green, for example, or Hondo Blue, and maybe another copy in the sideboard, mainly for when I'm fighting against the decks that really come to mind are, well, Han Blue, when you can swap something for a Crate Dragon, or like a Chewbacca or something like that, or a Luke. Against Double Green Palpatine when they're playing Devastators and, you know, Reinforcement Walkers. When you're against the other soft control decks, that's where Choose Sides becomes really relevant. And it is a strong sideboard card, whereas previously I was imagining it was completely unplayable. The next card's a little bit weird because it's not a card that people think is bad or anything like that. It's just forgotten about. I can't tell you how many deck lists I've looked at and I see Waylay and they're playing Heroism. And I'm like, why aren't you just running Spare the Target? And they're like, what? I didn't even know that card existed. Guys, if you read Spare the Target, it's return an enemy non-leader unit to its owner's hand. Collect that unit's bounties. What does Waylay read? What is it? Return a non-leader unit to its owner's hand. It literally just has less text on this comparatively to Spare the Target. Now, I'm trying to think of like what scenario that you'd want Waylay over Spare the Target, and anything that has to do with tricks if you're playing like Jabba. But guess what? That's usually a villainy card. This is like in 99% of decks. If you're playing Waylay and you're playing Heroism, you should just be playing Spare the Target. And it's not like it's irrelevant. One of the big things that I've seen is Dr. Evazan is a bounty card that is still played a decent amount in the meta. Spare the Targeting a Dr. Evazan allows you to also collect that unit's bounties. The difference between waylaying a Dr. Evazan and Spare the Targeting a Dr. Evazan is immense. It completely changes the scope of what you could be doing with a card like this. And again, it's a minor effect that doesn't apply to every game, right? Dr. Evazan's one of the few cards that does have a bounty that is played in the meta regularly. But when it does happen, you are literally just getting free percentage points in that matchup because you're playing Spare the Target over Waylay. So anytime you're looking at a deck and you're like, oh, I'm going to drop in some Waylays. And heck, you could even be playing Spare the Target and Waylay. I've had many decks where I'm playing Cunning Heroism and I'm playing like 4 copies total, like 3 Spare the Targets, 1 Waylay, maybe even another one in the sideboard because the card is very strong. And Waylay has been a staple of the meta ever since set 1. And guess what? I have yet to see someone play Spare the Target against me. Like, yet to see Spare the Target being played against me. And I've seen a ton of Waylays in Cunning Heroism decks. So just swap them out, guys. Just swap them out. It's free value. Next one is a card that I've gotten intimately familiar with just because of us playing a lot of draft where I'm at my local store, and then I strike true. Dealing damage to an enemy unit from a friendly unit is extremely powerful. This essentially is a removal effect in a aspect that doesn't normally get a whole lot of removal effects, with the exception of like Overwhelming Barrage or some sort of ambush technique. This is something that is a little bit surprising, and it did start to pop up a little bit when Double Green Palpatine started to become a little bit more popular. You used to see like 1 to 2 copies of Strike True in your decks, but this can honestly be expanded amongst most of, you know, green mid-range decks like Luke, Command, or any other, again, mid-range style of deck that's like Green Palpatine, that's more rampy. But even Boba Green, for example, could be running Strike True. Now, you do have some better options in some cases. Like, I would generally speaking take Overwhelming Barrage over Strike True. And if you only have like 5 to 6 slots of, hey, I'm going to use these slots for removal effects, Strike True may not make the cut in some situations. But there are some decks, again, like Double Green Palpatine, that are like, okay, I'm running these effects, and then Strike True ends up just being better because you only really care about the early game and removing some of the units in the early game. And yet I see basically nobody putting this in their deck. And that is pretty crazy to me, especially considering something like Overwhelming Barrage and something like heck, Command is being played so frequently because of the type of effect these are going with obviously significant bonuses. But this does come at a nice resource discount and is not locked into aspect penalties like Command and like Overwhelming Barrage are. There are a lot of situations in Command-based decks where you could be playing a Vigilance removal, like Takedown, like Vanquish, like Rival's Fall, whatever it is. But then also Strike True will actually end up being better in those cases. But just because it isn't necessarily as known about, isn't as popular, people just completely omit Strike True. Not, again, a card that I'll be playing in every deck, but these are cards that really, really people just forget about. And are quite good. Next one is Lom Pyke, and this is a card that people have slowly started to incorporate in a lot of their decks. And again, to be fair, I was one of those people that was like, oh, I'll try him out. I'm not super convinced, but earlier on into set 2, when we did get to play more and more of Lom Pyke, when the meta was starting to get flushed out, I got more and more impressed by a card like Lom Pyke. This is not a card where you're like, oh, this is a game winner on its own. This is more like a value for resource play. The card that I think about when I compare Lom Pyke on the heroism side of things is like a Kanan, where Kanan doesn't win you the game, but it gives you enough value to where it's quite annoying and has a good enough stat line to where it also kind of provides problems for your opponent. And Lom Pyke is kind of in that same vein. There are some situations where just giving that shield token to something is immensely powerful and can really save kind of your ground force by just passing around some shield tokens to an unnecessary unit. And especially in Vigilance, you just take down it, or Vanquish, or Rival's Fall that you gave a shield token to later. By the way, you can give multiple shield tokens to that same unit to kind of negate the value, where you just give shield tokens to your own units and get some value there. It also has that smuggle aspect where you're going to be playing like Hondo Blue and getting a more powerful Lom Pyke out of the deal, or getting some experience token on your other units. But at the end of the day, it is a 4 resource 4/6, and that is a very powerful stat line. As I said, Kanan is a really nice comparison. Kanan is just oftentimes good because of its 4/5 stat line. It killing 4/4s and living outside of it. Of course, it has all manner of other stuff going for it, but so does Lom Pyke. Heck, it's even an Underworld card, which tends to matter here in these villainy decks that we're playing these days. Definitely give Lom Pyke a try. And as I said, with that smuggle, you can pretty much never be sad about putting Lom Pyke in your deck, because at the end of the day, you just resource it, and hey, look at that, free value later on in the game. This next card is a card that I talked about a lot in recent decks, but Bounty Hunter's Quarry is one of those cards that's a little bit unassuming, and when you look at it, you're like, is it really going to actually be that effective? Essentially, this 1 resource upgrade that allows you to play a 3 resource play or less for free is a really big bump. And any deck that's focused around kind of units and trading with your opponent's units and not necessarily trying to ignore them, while also having enough 3/2 resource plays to where you can consistently hit at least something, but more often than not, you want to hit a 3 resource play, this is an option for you. Now, when I consider how many cards I need to kind of reliably hit on this Bounty Hunter's Quarry, you're talking like 20 to 25 is what I want to see in a deck, which means, 11 to 12 turn 1 plays, at least like 8 to, 13 turn 2 plays, 3 resource units, and they have to be units. Because if you're not hitting those on a 95% consistency rating, obviously Bounty Hunter's Quarry gets worse. But you need that, as well as the interest to actually trade with your opponent's units or kind of get those value trades in. If you're playing Sabine Green, you don't want to be playing Bounty Hunter's Quarry, because 90% of the time you want your opponent to be forced to hit your units because you're the aggressor. But if you're playing, let's say, I don't know, like a Boba Green, and you're trying to go a little bit more mid-range, or you're playing like Palpatine Green. Granted, I don't think Palpatine Green is the deck for Bounty Hunter's Quarry, because there's too many events in that deck and not enough 3 resource plays or less. But Luke Green, or these decks that are trying to go a little bit more value oriented while also still kind of curving out, that's where Bounty Hunter's Quarry gets extremely powerful, especially if you can go like turn 1, play a 2 resource play like a Battlefield Rain. Turn 2, play another 2 resource play alongside Bounty Hunter's Quarry, kill their units, then get a 3 resource play. Suddenly, you are immensely ahead of the game just because you went a little bit wider than your opponent, while also getting resource cost reductions on the things that you are playing, which can be absolutely massive overall. The next card is a card that has literally just completely vanished off the face of the earth, and that's mainly because of set 2. Anytime you see Vanquish, this 5-cost event to defeat a non-leader unit, anytime you saw that card in set 1, which was a good amount, it's been basically replaced by Rival's Fall, which is a 1 cost higher with the ability to defeat leaders as well. Now, I was also in that same boat where I was like, oh, Rival's Fall, probably just going to take the place of Vanquish and just be solid. I still think Rival's Fall is good, but I think Vanquish is also good. There is a huge difference between 5 and 6 resources and can completely change the aspect of the game. There's also a ton of reason to be playing like Fell the Dragons and takedowns on top of it all. But the fact that Vanquish has completely vanished off the face of the earth in favor of Rivals Fall is a little bit strange to me, especially since most of the time Rivals Fall, while you can save it for leaders, there are oftentimes other ways to deal with leaders. And you oftentimes, at least as far as I've seen, are using Rivals Fall on things like Podameron or things like Wrecker or Luke or whatever. And Vanquish just gives you a 1 resource discount, which in some cases might not matter because you might be on 6 resources, you use a Vanquish, you can't use the other resource. But in other cases, like if they play Podameron and you had a Rivals Fall, now suddenly, let's say they had initiative, they play Podameron, you need to play your removal because you need to prevent them from attacking or whatever because they have too much damage on the board or something else happens. You kind of are forced to take initiative. You might take a hit from Podameron on that turn rather than just killing the Podameron itself on a turn earlier. Now, again, it's not an insane difference between Vanquish and Rivals Fall in terms of where Vanquish is better and where Rivals Fall is better. But to see it completely vanish is a little bit strange. And I've oftentimes been including, 1 to 2 copies based on what I'm looking for in certain matchups. If I'm oftentimes fighting against Podamerons and I'm fighting against, Wreckers and Rays and whatever it is people are playing earlier on into the game, oftentimes Vanquish is exactly what I'm looking for because I am actually able to play it a turn sooner than Rivals Fall. And in some cases, Takedown nor Fell the Dragon will hit that unit. And in those cases, that's where Vanquish comes in. Albeit, it still can't deal with leaders. But there's, again, not many situations where you want to be killing a leader instead of just hitting it, or killing a leader with a specific removal instead of just hitting it with units or doing some other thing to deal with it, which usually is the case. The last card we're going to talk about is Shoot First. Now, this is another one which I feel like was played in like 2 to 3 copies of in a lot of decks in set 1. And then as soon as set 2 came, it's kind of fallen off the face of the earth where people might be playing one of in Boba Yellow, and it's not even that consistent. There's a lot of good cards from set 2, don't get me wrong, but Shoot First is super powerful. The ability to attack with that unit and essentially act as a one resource plus an action from your unit to kill a enemy unit and not die is really, really amazing. And this is something that oftentimes, especially in Boba Yellow, is better than it even looks because it's free. All it requires is that action from your unit itself. And that's what I mean by free, because you get that resource back by killing that unit with that unit that you had on the battlefield. This is a really powerful card, and I oftentimes will be playing it in Han Yellow these days, Boba Yellow, if I'm playing Sabine Yellow. Honestly, any deck that's looking to be on the more aggressive side, or maybe even more value trade oriented, Shoot First has been pretty solid. I've even started to incorporate in my Ray Yellow decks that I've been playing just because of the value that Shoot First can bring. If you're ever able to shoot first anything, it's immensely devastating for your opponent, generally speaking, and especially so in something like Boba Yellow. I would have expected to see 1 to 2 copies of this in a lot of different decks as sort of a pseudo removal option, but allows you to keep your unit alive for when that matters to put pressure on your opponents. So again, any deck that's looking to get a little bit more value and keep their units on the board and not necessarily take any damage, really exceptionally useful for those tempo decks that are relying on those specific scenarios. But let me know about the cards that you would expect people to be playing, or maybe you just have found they've absolutely decimated you, and yet you don't see more people playing them. I can tell you there's a bunch of other cards that I might have put on the list if I saw them, potentially being good in other decks. Something like a Village Protectors, I know I've gotten absolutely murdered by, and I started putting it in my decks like Han Blue and Ray Red, that type of card. I've also seen things like, Imprisoned do a decent amount of work on like something random that I didn't expect it to do. Granted, I still think Imprisoned is bad, but that's the type of card where you're like, dang, I got absolutely decimated by this. Why is it good? And can it be expanded across multiple different decks? Let me know your answers in the description down below. And whether you think one of these cards on my list should not be there, I want to know. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all for the next one.